BMK3, and I went through and marked up this PDF so you could see what I've done. So the first thing I want to note is that you need to saw cut these joints between 1 inch and 1.5 inches deep. A lot of people have a tendency to go a little too shallow. Typically, the depth of your saw needs to be approximately a fourth of the depth of the entire slab. So if you have a 4 inch slab, you need to be 1 inch. If you have a 6 inch slab, you need to be more like 1.5 inches. So it's better to go a little bit deeper. You don't want to go all the way through the slab, but trying to go that inch to 1.5 inches is much better. I've seen some issues on our jobs recently where they're only a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch deep. They're really shallow, and that doesn't really do much of anything. So make sure we're doing that. Second part of that is if you notice, what I've done is I've come off of all of these outside corners. The outside corners are the most likely location that a crack is going to start. As that slab starts to shrink, those are the weakest points on the slab. I didn't do every single outside corner. There's a few of those outside corners that if we did every single one of them, it would be a little bit much on that. And then it's likely that it's going to take whatever the path of least resistance is anyway. And so some of these I did whatever the longest run or the biggest area is going to be. So I just started going around. I noticed right here, you're going to end up with a weak spot coming across there. You're going to end up with one coming across there. You're going to end up with one coming off of one or the other of these corners, maybe both. So I looked at that and said, okay, well, let's divide this right in half. Typically, the rule of thumb is with the size of your squares of your concrete area, you want to be about a third or 3 times what the depth of the slab is in inches converted into feet. So if your slab is 4 inches thick, you don't want to be any more than 12 inches apart. So 3 times 4 is 12. You don't want to be any more than 12 feet apart on any of your joints. So you could be a 12 by 12 square with a 4 inch thick slab and you should be pretty safe. It's okay to be a little smaller. And in the case of a lower level, if it's not going to be an exposed concrete when we're finished, I'm okay with it being just a little bit larger than that if it makes more sense. But you don't want to be a lot bigger than that. The next thing that I was also looking at is placement of where some of those interior footings are. It's more likely, is particularly if you already have your footings placed, it's more likely that it's going to crack in those footings than it is in other locations. So coming off of this corner right there made more sense than coming off of this corner. If I come off of that corner, I'm right on top of that footing right there. Same thing right here, splitting this space as opposed to coming off of this corner, coming across where this footing is right there and splitting that so that it's a little more equidistance in that space makes a little more sense. Keeping some of those right on those footings. You're not always going to have that case, but it does make sense to try and do that. It does help that a little bit. So the other thing that I want to point out here, a couple other things. First of all, is 6 mil polyplastic underneath your whole slab. Make sure you're doing that. Make sure you're doing at least a 6 inch overlap on any of the joints and that you're taping those with a skip tape. I just use duct tape or something like that usually. I also usually tape it to any of the vertical stacks, any of the plumbing that's coming through the floor, make sure that everything is sealed up really well. You can see right here on the plans, this one's calling for installing a vapor retarder consisting of a 6 mil plastic right there. Make sure that you're doing that. That's a really important part of sealing up this slab for both moisture coming through from below as well as for your radon vent system. So very critical for that. And then also around all the edges, make sure that that's nice and tight to your foundation edge. You don't want it coming up the edge because it will affect the concrete pour, but you do want it going pretty much right to that edge. So make sure you're doing that. And then the last thing that I had on here was these 45-degree rebar. All these outside corners, I like to put a small piece of rebar on all of those. It doesn't need to be some 8-10 foot long piece of rebar. It only needs to be a couple of feet long, 2 to maybe 4 feet long. I usually just find a bunch of random scraps of rebar that are sitting around at the job. Even if they've got J bars or bent ends or things like that, it works just fine. You're just trying to get a piece of bar that's spanning that corner. It helps prevent that crack. Most commonly, that crack's going to come off something like this. Right off that corner, something on a weird angle. As it does that, it has a tendency to try and pull apart right there. Having that rebar in there really helps strengthen those corners and helps keep that from happening and make that a lot stronger and a lot less likely to crack. So that's kind of the information here that I wanted to give you guys and make sure you guys are familiar with that. Make sure that